he gave back to directors from USA the confidence that a Western can be a great movie.
I went to see Once Upon a Time in the West not knowing what to expect, and all of a sudden, what is this thing?
My reaction to the film the very first time I saw it was one of astonishment.
Everybody loves what's
You know anything about a man going around playing a harmonica?
Looks like we're shy of one horse.
You brought two too many.
I'm here alone in the hands of a bandit who smelled money.
You got yourself into something bigger than you are.
Sergio Leone once said, I was born in the cinema, almost. His father was a director of silent movies, started working around about 1910. His mother was an actress in silent film, who actually appeared, remarkably enough, in the very first Italian Western, a movie called Vampira Indiana, the Indian Vampire, 1914, where she played an Indian princess. He was an only child. He grew up in Rome in the 20s and 30s, but kept visiting film sets when his father was working at Cinecittà in Rome, the great studio there, or on location in Naples. So he grew up in the film world of Rome. His father introduced him into the film business, and a lot of his dad's contacts were how Sergio got started.
Dunque io Sergio Leone l'ho conosciuto che era un ragazzo, ero giovane anch'io, che faceva lo script e batteva la clacchetta. Quindi Sergio Leone è uno che ha fatto la bottega, non so come si traduce la bottega in inglese, cioè ha cominciato da ragazzo assistendo sul set alla ripresa di un film.
A man called Mario Bonnard, who was a close friend of Sergio's dad, worked with Sergio Leone on 8 films with Sergio as assistant for Mario Bonnard, and culminating in The Last Days of Pompeii with Steve Reeves.
Quindi negli anni, perché una volta bisognava fare degli anni di preparazione prima di fare il regista o il direttore della fotografia. Adesso si improvvisa un po' tutto, sono tutti messia scesi dal cielo, già pronti, già preparati. E quindi Sergio negli anni ha fatto l'assistente di altri bravi registi come Mario Soldati, e poi lui fece, poi cominciò a fare l'aiuto regista con i film storici romani, che fece anche Cleopatra, faceva la seconda unit. Dopodiché tornò con Bonnate per fare Gli ultimi giorni di Pompei, sempre un film romano, e durante questo film Bonnard morì e lui finì il film. Il film era Gli ultimi giorni di Pompei. Dopo questo film lui cominciò a fare il regista al 100% e fece Il Colosso di Rodi, che era anche quello un film storico.
So he gets into the Italian film industry and makes lots and lots of films as an assistant to Italian filmmakers in boom years, the economic miracle years of the 1950s. Simultaneously, he gets a lot of experience on Hollywood movies in Rome. So, for example, Quo Vadis. He was an assistant making the chariot race in Ben-Hur for William Wyler. Sergio slightly overclaimed about Ben-Hur. I mean, he did give some interviews where he claimed he directed the chariot race. The chariot race was directed by Andrew Martin, but Leone was part of the Italian crew who worked at Cinecittà on the Antioch Circus. So his training was partly in medium-budget Italian films and also in action sequences of Hollywood films. And I think his training says a lot about where he subsequently went.
C'è una cosa molto importante che va sottolineata di Sergio. Sergio aveva capito che perché il cinema italiano, il suo cinema, potesse avere un'esplosione nel mondo, e nonostante lui amasse e fosse anche costretto a mettere degli attori italiani, gli cambiò il nome. E tutti gli attori italiani che hanno lavorato con lui, a meno questi dove ero io, per esempio, perché avevano già attori importanti.
In 1962, there's a kind of almost a collapse of the Italian film industry. Cleopatra has been made in Italy and bombed completely. The Leopard by Visconti had just been made by Titanus Productions and bombed. Sodom and Gomorrah had just been made in Italy and it bombed. And the whole, the Italian film industry has always been a stop-go sort of industry, or was then. You have one hit, everyone rushes after that hit and rips it off. And then it goes bust 4 or 5 years later, and then they regroup, and there's another hit, Well, the great hit in the late 50s was a Hercules film with Steve Reeves, which caused hundreds and hundreds of these sword and sandal epics, so-called, to be produced, of which Sergio, of course, got involved. But then in 62, bust. And the whole of the Italian film industry was like a desert. Unemployed technicians, unemployed craftspeople, a very, very depressed industry. And in 64, when Sergio made Fistful of Dollars, he found that trigger that set the entire machine of the Italian film industry going again, because it was one of the most successful films commercially that's ever been made in Italy.
I was looking around, I was seeing a desert. Sometime there was a new film of Antonioni, a new film of Visconti, a new film of Rossellini. But in general, the average wasn't exciting. I much more preferred what was going on in France with the Nouvelle Vague.
He kind of came along at the end of a cycle. Westerns had played themselves out, and finally on television, they were very, very popular in the 50s and 60s. I think that's how they got into the European sensibility, from TV. And basically all the stories of the kind of classic Westerns had been told. And I think his work was an incredible stylization, but also a summary of all the classic Western myths that we'd seen. Inside of Once Upon a Time in the West are several, references to other classic Westerns.
He took the whole experience of the American West and the American Western and distilled it into a certain kind of romantic view. He made us look at our Westerns again and try and get. He loved them and loved the pieces of the Western almost more than we did. And so he accentuated certain things. Plus, there is a wonderful cynicism that comes out of the politics of the time and out of him that pervades his movies.
I was a fan of all Westerns, really. I mean, I sort of grew up seeing Westerns on television and watching dreadful series like The Rifleman, Branded, The Virginian, and things like that. And then starting going to the pictures and really enjoyed cowboy films more than anything. There was a plethora of cowboy films in the 60s. And then around about the mid to the late 60s, we started getting the Italian ones. And having grown up on the American model and then seeing the Italian ones, it was quite a surprise. I remember seeing A Fistful of Dollars and being quite shocked by it, because it was so unusual. But I rapidly acquired a taste for them.
I've done 2 movies already, La Comare Secca, The Grim Reaper, and Before the Revolution. And now, after Before the Revolution, I had 3 years or 4 years of total silence. I couldn't find the money to do any more movies. I was looking for a gig, impossible to find it.
Christmas 1966. We're in the Super Cinema in Rome, which is a huge cinema, and they're showing The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Leone is in the projection booth, and he's with Dario Argento, the young Dario Argento, who then was a film critic, who loved Leone's films. And Leone liked people who loved his films. And they're chatting in the projection booth. Bertolucci comes in.
I said, you went to the first day to the first show. I said, yes, because I'm waiting for your movies, and I want to be one of the first one to see them. But why? So it was like an interrogation. It was becoming like an interrogation at the police station. And I started to be irritated. I was thinking, what is he doing? Is he fishing for compliments? I said, because in this moment of Italian cinema, I really think you are one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting director in our country. why? So, in fact, I wanted to leave, but I said, why? You know why? Because in the Westerns that you see, in general, the horses are shot from the side, in profile, and the horses are very beautiful in profile, but it's also very banal. And I like how you shoot the asses of the horses. And I saw that he was very, very curious at that moment. He said, yes. I said, yes, because you put your camera behind the horses, and in fact, like John Ford did a lot. And you see this solid animal, the strength of the animal, the power of the animal. And he looked at me, he did a long silence, a bit like in the editing of his movies, when two characters are looking at each other and you have a close-up, silence, the other close-up, another silence. And then he said, you will write my next movie.
Ma perché ti dico subito, io quando ho fatto Pugno di dollari, subito dopo ho fatto Per qualche dollaro in più e ho finito con, chiamiamola la trilogia, con Il buono, il brutto e il cattivo. Io dopo Il buono, il brutto e il cattivo non avrei voluto fare più western, perché avevo chiuso quel tipo di leggenda, quel tipo di storia, e avrei voluto fare C'era una volta in America, il film che sto finendo adesso. Se non che, dato che i successi, ecco, tutti sono pronti a non perdonarli, mentre invece l'insuccesso sì, quando io andai in America, la prima cosa che mi dissero, lei ci faccia un altro western e dopo le facciamo fare C'era una volta in America, ma per ora ci deve fare un altro western. E allora a questo punto nacque l'esigenza di fare un film che era completamente differente dagli altri tre, e nacque l'esigenza di una nuova trilogia che è nata proprio con C'era una volta il West, si è svolta con Giù la testa e finisce con C'era una volta in America, che sono i tre periodi che toccano l'America e le Americhe, se vogliamo.
He wants to recapture, in Once Upon a Time in the West, the magic of what he felt when he was a child, seeing those vast open spaces of the American Western. But at the same time, he didn't approve of their ideology very much. He thought they were too triumphalist and all about the American way and a man's got to do what a man's got to do, all the ideologies of the American Western. So there's this funny paradox. He loves it to death, but at the same time, he wants to criticize it. So he wanted to make a movie that was a kind of homage to all the Westerns he loved, but turn them round a bit so they meant something different this time.
It was fun, the first meeting. It was fun to meet him again. With Dario Argento, who co-wrote with me the treatment of Once Upon a Time in the West, the title existed already when we started to write. With Dario, who was also, like me, a kind of cinephile, Dario was the deputy movie critics of Paese Sera, an evening newspaper in Rome. And he agreed with me that Sergio was one of the most interesting directors in Italy in the 60s. So we were both excited.
So these three film buffs sit in Leone's house in spring 1967 and just watch all their favourite Westerns together. You know, The Searchers, Shane, Johnny Guitar, The Magnificent Seven, High Noon, particularly High Noon and Johnny Guitar, The Iron Horse by John Ford, all these films. And they just steep themselves in this culture of the Western.
One day at the beginning he told me, how did you shoot when you were a child? I said, what do you mean, how did you shoot? With a gun. Did you shoot cha, 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 like that, or pam, 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 like that?
And what they were doing was something that's very common now, but in 1967 was very uncommon, which is films about films. And in fact, the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard has called Leone the first postmodernist film director for this reason.
he had his first idea, which was again a movie about a man, like Pugno di dollari, Fistful of Dollars, and per qualche dollaro in più, the second one, and I think that every day, every meeting, I was trying to smuggle the idea. It's time now, dear Sergio, that you face a new challenge. Let's have a woman character in your film. At the beginning, he was very resistant. And then one day he told me, I think you're right. I think this time there will be a woman.
This, of course, was the first time that Leone had attempted a complex female character in his westerns. In the Dollars films, you know, the female parts are either, I'm afraid, either Madonnas or whores, basically. A very sort of Mediterranean juxtaposition. That in the first one there's a Madonna who's called Marisol, and she has a child called Little Jesus, in case you didn't get the point. and in others there's sort of hoteliers and tarts in these strange southwestern towns. So he hadn't really attempted a female part. But she's the entire centre of the plot.
There's a big long line of us who fell in love with Claudia Cardinale back in the 60s and have never gotten over it. I'm one of those people. I mean, she's just astonishing.
Oh, Claudia Cardinale has never been more beautiful in any movie. Or she's the whore with the heart of gold, you know. Every man wants to find the whore with the heart of gold. And she, too, becomes this sort of eternal figure at the end when he says, go out and let them look at you, you know. Give them a drink of water.
I know Sergio Leone a long time before. We are very good friends. And but when he asked me to come to talk about Once Upon a Time in the West, he had no script. He just explained all the film to me that day in his house.
And he said, you know, my first idea is that the woman arrives on a train and the camera is very low on the platform, and you see the train passing by and stopping, and the camera is very low, and you see the door of the train or the wagon opening, and then you see this gown coming, and the camera is under the gown and it becomes dark, and it's a woman, and I'm not sure she's wearing the knickers. That was his first way to accept to have a woman in this film. Then it was Claudia Cardinale.
They say that he was supposed to put the camera low to see that I wasn't wearing underwear. This is completely stupid, ridiculous, because I never accept to be naked. Nowhere, because I'm not selling my body to anyone. And Sergio never asked me to do that. I think he saw me like Jill. And for the first time in a Western, the woman has this kind of part, very important. And it was magnificent to be surrounded by actors like Henry Fonda, Charlie Bronson, and Jason Roberts, of course. Then I was surrounded by magnificent actors.
Henry Fonda had played Wyatt Earp. He played young Mr. Lincoln for John Ford and had said that playing Mr. Lincoln was to him like playing Jesus Christ. He was so noble. Hank Fonda was the noble American with bright blue eyes and that wonderful princely walk that he had.
Sergio Leone asked me to do a film and sent me the script, and I just couldn't believe it. And I met him, had lunch with him, and I hadn't seen his early films, so I didn't know Sergio Leone's reputation. And he realized I hadn't seen him, so he arranged for a screening, and I saw about 3.5 hours of his early films with Clint Eastwood. And one of them involved an actor friend of mine, and I called him, and he said, don't miss it, just go. To hell with the script, just go. You'll fall in love with him, he's marvelous. So I accepted. And in the months before I went, I kept thinking, now, this heavy son of a bitch, how am I gonna... I finally went to an optometrist and had contact lenses made to make my baby blues brown. And I grew a mustache with a little divot that looked a little bit like the guy that shot Lincoln. I'm trying to look like a son of a bitch. And I arrive at the studio in Rome, and Sergio takes one look at me and says, off. He was buying the baby blues. He wanted, and I didn't know why until I realized. In my opening scene in the film, and you see 5 or 6 long-robed, brimmed hat characters that you don't recognize, but just ominous looking, converging from the sagebrush with rifles and handguns. And this terrible moment that you just watched a farm family massacred. And they start to walk towards you, converging towards you, and then the camera switches back to the little boy who's standing there just petrified, watching these people come to him. And then into the foreground of the little boy comes a figure. The camera very slowly is coming around. And Sergio Leone had cast me because he could imagine at this moment the audience saying, Jesus Christ, it's Henry Fonda.
Of him, I remember the way he was walking and the way he was moving. It was like slow motion. He was moving in a very strange way, fantastic.
The idea of Henry Fonda, I think, was like a very cynical joke on the part of Leone, because he saw what nobody else saw in Fonda, that here was a guy who, although he played endlessly nice, good guys, there was something very cold about Fonda, something very distant about him, and that could play a really bad guy.
Henry Fonda, come tutti gli attori americani, sono dei gran professionisti, non c'è nessun problema. Tutti gli attori, lui non parlava inglese, Sergio, e tutti gli attori lavoravano molto volentieri con lui, tutti sono venuti sempre volentieri, infatti lui ha lavorato con dei grossi attori.
In my opinion, Charles Bronson is the key to Once Upon a Time in the West. His character is the haunted loner. The man out of nowhere, only taken a step further. He has a past and a story to tell.
I suppose there's lots of reasons why Bronson was chosen for that part. I mean, there are stories that we're told that other actors were offered the part first, that James Coburn was offered the part, that Eastwood was offered the part. But when you see Bronson in it, you really do think it couldn't have been anybody else.
Inside the dusters, there were 3 men.
So?
Inside the men, there were 3 bullets.
He was always in a corner, playing with a ball like this all the time. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was a very mysterious man.
Well, another interesting piece of casting was Jason Robards, who was a theatre actor, really, as part of a sort of theatre acting dynasty. His father had been a theatre actor and had worked in the silent movies. So to put him as a rough and ready baddie was actually quite a risky piece of casting.
With Jason Robards, fantastic relationship. And in fact, I remember when we did, again, another movie together, Werner Herzog, Fitzcarraldo.
He has a great speech to Claudia Cardinelli when they're out building the railroad, and he tells her that, if she goes out there and somebody whacks her in the butt, just ignore it because they deserve it. It's a great moment in the film.
And if one of them should pat you behind, just make believe it's nothing. They earned it.
Gabriele Fazzetti was a well-known matinee idol of Italian cinema in the 1940s, who also had moved into theatre work in the 1950s and had become a sort of grand figure in running film festivals and running theatre festivals. So he was sort of semi-administrative, grand figure of the Italian cultural scene. And again, for him to appear in a Western was quite interesting. It's like casting Laurence Olivier in a Western.
Was it necessary that you kill all of them? I only told you to scare them. People scare better when they're dying.
And can you tell me what good was your stupid massacre?
La parte moto l'ho avuta per caso, perché era destinata a un altro attore. Il quadratore era in quel momento occupato con il teatro, quindi non poteva accettarla. Tutto lì. Quindi è stata destino. Molti film che io ho fatto sono stati decretati dal destino. Io ho dato la possibilità ad attori, anche come Salerno, di venire fuori, perché io non ho accettato i motivi. E lui e altri hanno dato a me la possibilità.
At the beginning of the film, you have Woody Strode, John Ford's black actor, who's always very noble, Sergeant Rutledge, Pompey in the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance more recently. Well, he's a killer in this, a ruthless killer with a sawed-off shotgun with a guard round the trigger that makes it look like a John Wayne rifle. So you've got the connotation of Woody Strode, and it surprises you. He doesn't normally play people like that. Jack Elam, who'd played the second baddie from the left in countless Hollywood movies. You remember him forever for that sort of few minutes where he's sitting at the station with a fly in his beard.
There is a story, which may even be true, that Leone approached Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef for Once Upon a Time in the West and said, I want you to be in my film. And they all went, oh, great, we're all going to be the main guys like before. And he goes, no, you're going to be killed in the first 5 minutes. It was a tremendous idea because he's making a conscious break, if the story's true, with everything he'd done before.
They are the true example of where a face is a landscape. Jack Elam sitting there trying to get the fly in the barrel of the gun, you know, is wonderful. Woody Strode with the water plopping in the hat. And of course, the best part of it is they get shot down.
We start to shoot in Spain, Almeria, and then we went to Monument Valley to do some scene. And, well, I remember lots of scenes we did because they are very precise in my mind, because he was shooting in a very special way, especially on the faces of the actors.
This was the first spaghetti western that was filmed outside Italy and Spain. And Leone actually went and filmed quite lengthy sequences in Monument Valley so as to take advantage of those great mittens and buttes that had been the stock in trade of John Ford.
Sergio Leone was determined to include Monument Valley in this film, the famous valley with the cathedral-type red rocks which had been used by John Ford in 8 movies. He went on a recce in a Jeep, Monument Valley tours, round Monument Valley, and Tonino Dellicoli, the director of photography, went with him, and remembers Leone having total recall on every shot from a John Ford film. So he'd, like a little boy, he'd rush around and say, that's the Searchers, and go, that's Cheyenne Autumn, and just remembering exactly where Ford put the camera.
Beh, c'era una volta nel West, era un po' il buono, il brutto e il cattivo come ambientazione. E c'era una volta nel West, mi ricordo che lui ricordava tutti bene i film americani, per esempio Ombre Rosse, lui lo ricordava molto bene, tant'è vero che con C'era una volta in West siamo andati nei stessi posti dove avevano girato Ombre Rosse, la corsa dei cavalli, con le montagne classiche dell'Arizona. E abbiamo fatto dei pezzi perché gli esterni, il Calessino con Claudia Cardinale e Paolo Stoppa, i passaggi li abbiamo fatti lì. Poi quando arrivavano alla Posada, che era questa specie di fermata di posta che si trovava in mezzo al deserto del West, L'interno di questa posata l'abbiamo fatta a Cinecittà e l'esterno l'abbiamo ricostruito lì, ma soltanto il di fuori. E quindi la buona parte del film C'era una volta il West l'abbiamo fatta in Almeria, in Spagna, cioè nel deserto di Almeria.
He made most of the movie in Spain and had the devil's own job matching up. Spain, which is olive colour and sand colour and light with the red of Monument Valley. In fact, he imported bags of dust from Monument Valley. So there's a sequence where Jason Robards is supposed to be riding through Monument Valley. His men arrive at the door, Cheyenne's men, and all this red dust comes through the door. It was imported from Monument Valley, chucked through the door in Spain to match it up.
Com'era diverso lavorare in America e in Europa. Eravamo in un piccolissimo centro, si chiamava Cayenta. È un centro che era situato proprio tra 4 stati americani, mi ricordo. E quindi non posso dire di essere stato in una grossa città, quindi aver capito il sistema americano, eccetera, eccetera. Eravamo isolati, erano truppe che lavorava in questo posto, mi ricordo una specie di dirupo, di montagna. Quindi differenza non c'era.
Carlo Simi was an architect who had actually worked first with Sergio Leone on Romulus and Remus, a film made in the early 1960s, although they didn't get to know each other, but they really got to know each other on Fistful of Dollars. And Simi was brilliant at doing these larger-than-life sets set in the Southwest.
Gli americani hanno dei grossi attori, però il resto passa un po' in secondo. Invece lui, la scenografia soprattutto, teneva molto alle scenografie, alla verità. Lui possedeva delle pile di libri così, come documentazione. Lui aveva tutta la documentazione fotografica dell'epoca e lo scenografo, che era Simi, che purtroppo adesso non c'è più, rivedeva esattamente quello che lui gli faceva vedere dalle fotografie. Allora i soldi c'erano, perché i film già erano sovvenzionati dagli americani in gran parte. E quindi C'era una volta il western, poi il buono, il brutto e il cattivo.
Take the 3 key sets, the railroad station at the beginning, Sweetwater, the actual ranch. And the third and the most expensive set is the town of Flagstaff. In low-budget American westerns or TV westerns, the town is completely finished, it's beautifully clean and tidy, you know, it's been there forever. This is a town that someone thought up the week before, and they're in the process of knocking it together. It was an expensive set. In fact, the cost of the set of the town of Flagstaff was more than the entire budget of Fistful of Dollars.
That first sequence kind of summarizes a lot of American films, John Ford and Howard Hawks westerns that we've seen before, in the way that that whole station was built. The bare wooden planks, the windmill squeaking across the way, everything about it.
The second is Sweetwater, which is interesting because he was trying to put over that Brett McBain was the sort of guy who really was thinking of the future. He's got a piece of land that has water on it, nobody knows that, and he wants to build a ranch that's going to last because he knows this is going to be the centre of a town one day in Sweetwater. So it's much bigger and more substantial than it needs to be. It's like, you know, a focal point of a town. It was actually made out of bits of wood that were left behind by Orson Welles when he was making Chimes at Midnight, his Falstaff movie. There were lots of medieval battles involving pikes and bits of wood and stockades, and they left all the wood behind in Spain, so they bought a job lot of wood and made Sweetwater out of it. So what you're watching is the medieval planks from Chimes at Midnight turned into a chalet.
Sergio Leone più che difficile era un regista perfezionista, amava la perfezione, il dettaglio, molte cose che magari io come direttore della fotografia, non so, un mobile fuori posto in campo lungo, nessuno se ne accorgeva. Lui però perdeva tempo per mettere a posto quel mobile. Ma di come stiamo perdendo tempo? Era una questione sua personale, era un'angoscia sua. Quindi era per la perfezione del massimo.
He had endless meetings with Carlo Simi about what it should look like. He was very concerned about, you know, things like how much dust should be on the costumes. They mustn't look too clean.
But gradually, as their relationship worked together and they became more comfortable around each other, Simi just blossomed and started to do the most extraordinary production design and the most extraordinary costume design. When they got as far as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I thought, well, they can't get any better than this. You know, this is the ultimate. And then they went into this quite surreal and exaggerated world of Once Upon a Time in the West.
One thing that's never discussed in these movies is that these actors wear an incredible amount of makeup, as if they're all sunburned. And you really get a sense of the dust and the heat and the location.
The makeup can change your expressions, the way you look, the eyes. And it's very, very important to have the good and the right makeup. For the costumes or the makeup, of course, I can talk. I mean, if I don't recognize me physically, the makeup and the hairdo, I'm allowed to say something. But the design were perfect.
Naturalmente mi acconciò, cioè mi tagliò i capelli, io ricordo bene, infatti avevo i capelli cortissimi, e poi questa armatura di cuoio pesantissima, perché lui era un uomo malato, una malattia alle ossa, per cui non poteva camminare. Infatti lui cammina in questo vagone che si è fatto fare reggendosi a delle sbarre di ferro.
Appena faceva il nome degli attori che volevano attore, questo era pronto per venire, compreso il protagonista di C'era una volta l'Oeste. Bronzo era un fenomeno, non parlava mai. E dice vai lì e andava lì, vai lì, vai a dormire, vai a mangiare. Fonda lo stesso, perché Fonda venne con la moglie, lui aveva una moglie italiana, Fonda. E con il caldo che faceva, Simi, il costumista, gli metteva i costumi, aveva visto che Sergio gli aveva fatto vedere le sue fotografie, e pesavano, faceva caldo. E lui provava con gli attori. Ma dico, ma scusa, metti una controfigura e poi lo fai, perché faceva l'inquadratura. E no, perché dice come porta il cappello lui, non lo porta un altro, io devo fare l'inquadratura che sta dentro al cappello e doveva partire e poi andare indietro. Insomma, senza Fonda lui non poteva fare l'inquadratura. E questo poveraccio stava delle mezze ore fermo sotto al sole per fare l'inquadratura, ma non ha detto mai niente. La scena di apertura del C'era una volta l'Oeste rispecchia un po' la tecnica di Sergio Leone, l'attesa è spasmodica, che questi aspettano questo killer che deve arrivare. E poi in questi inizi scorrono i titoli di testa per coprire un po' il tempo che Sergio prende per questa attesa così di pathos. Per lui il pathos, come nei duelli, le cose, era sempre tutti questi primi piani, questi occhi, poi c'era il fatto della mosca, carino, il fatto della mosca che gli ronzava intorno a uno di questi attori che facevano questi che la attendevano per ammazzarlo. E questa mosca era stata fabbricata ma non funzionava. E allora, perché doveva andargli sul labbro, lui la doveva scacciare, ma però non si riusciva con la mosca finta. Allora dico, andate a prendere un po' di miele, una cosa, stiamo lì, aspettiamo, metti il miele qui, così sta mosca girò e la mosca vera si posò sul labbro. Poi quella che lui infila con la rivoltella era finta. Questo è l'inizio. Ma queste attese Sergio le ha sempre fatte, però il pubblico le ha sempre sopportate. Se le faceva un altro, perché riusciva a creare appunto questo con il montaggio.
The main characteristics of Leone's films, I think, are their slowness and a visual style which juxtaposes extreme close-ups with very wide shots. He films landscape better than any Western director since Ford. But he also uses the faces of the characters as a sort of geography as well, and gets really close to the faces and shows you the pock marks, and if they haven't got scars, he gives them scars, So the faces sort of become the landscape, and I think that's something that he, more than any other spaghetti Western director, was responsible for.
He shot in broad daylight, allowing him a very deep focus. He'd have foreground objects very close to the camera and background objects. And the movement of those two objects in opposition was extremely powerful. He used that before in the Dollars trilogy. And we used it to great extent here in Once Upon a Time in the West.
My favorite scene in Once Upon a Time in the West is the arrival of Jill on the station.
And there's that amazing moment when Claudia Cardinali arrives at the station. She gets off the train. She talks to the station master. You know, how do I find my way to Sweetwater? And the camera, you don't see the town yet. All you see is the station. And the camera goes up and you see the roof, the tiled roof. And there's this swell in the music, sort of crescendo. And there, just behind the station, you didn't even know it was there, is an entire town in the process of being constructed.
Sole, era un inferno come calore, come polvere, come tutto. Quindi le difficoltà erano un po' queste. E quella scena della gru, della stazione quando arriva la Cardinale, non c'era una volta il West, quella scena della gru che fu fatta, siamo stati una giornata, mezza giornata, perché lui sempre per la perfezione, perché quando arrivavamo su al paese tutti i movimenti delle figurazioni, delle carrozze dovevano essere tutti sincronizzati, quindi c'era un po' di difficoltà in questo senso, ma insomma niente di importante.
The camera work in his films always has a very sort of deliberate composition where there is a great landscape filled with people and stuff and everything, and then half the landscape will be somebody's face. He was always looking for people whose face told the whole story.
Ma francamente, sai, è l'ambiente che fa già la fotografia. Stai in Almeria, stai a Milano, già è tutto diverso. Quindi Claudia Cardinale io già la conoscevo perché avevo fatto altri film con lei, quindi conoscevo già il suo viso. Quindi non c'erano grandi approcci da fare, fotografia normale, poi è l'ambiente che ti fa inventare il tipo di fotografia da fare in quel momento.
Tonino Delle Colli is a magnificent director of photo, and I've been doing lots of movies with him. And first of all, he's a very funny man. I never had problems with him because he knows how to put lights. He's not, he doesn't improvise. He knows exactly the way to photograph.
People think that Leone storyboarded his films because they look so designed, so well composed, which I think they were, but he didn't. He had it all in his head. He'd listen to everybody, he'd talk a lot in the months before, during pre-production. He'd talk to Simi, he'd talk to the editor, he'd talk to Morricone, and he'd have an absolute sense of what he wanted on the set. Apparently he was a brilliant storyteller.
Oltre che la mosca c'è anche il pezzo, la goccia sul cappello, che veniva giù dal serbatoio dell'acqua, ma siamo stati in una mattinata a fare quella goccia che si poteva fare in un quarto d'ora, ma lui quella goccia doveva centrare il punto che voleva lui, e quindi una goccia che veniva da 3 metri, insomma, e stava lì, ha girato finché la goccia. Poi ho detto, siccome dovevamo partire per andare in America, per fare gli esterni in America, eravamo tutti pronti, era l'ultima scena da fare in Spagna, io me ne sono andato, ho lasciato l'assistente con sta goccia, dico date, gira finché ti dice. Quando è stato al montaggio, dopo tutto quello che avevamo girato per questa goccia, mi ha detto, oh vedi, tu te ne sei andato, dici, ma io la goccia buona non ce l'ho. Non aveva girato lì la testina, non aveva la goccia buona per darmi il torto, per farmi sentire in torto che sono partito.
Like most Italian films, this was post-synchronized, the entire film. So they shot natural sound. And because, Cinecitta's built on the flight path of Fiumicino Airport, I mean, there's jets going over all the time, for example, they then looped in the sound afterwards, and Robards was apparently brilliant at that.
Because they don't shoot with sound, there's a lot more, I don't call it daring in the camera work. The camera goes everywhere because they're not worried about sound booms. They're not worried about miking the actors.
Un film di Sergio Leone che durava 3 ore e mezzo, tutti lo guardavano e queste 3 ore e mezzo passavano. Questo dipendeva dal montaggio. Lui impiegava 3 mesi, 4 mesi per girare il film e 6 mesi per montarlo, perché ricominciava da capo, dammi quel pezzo, si ricordava tutto, quello che aveva girato, anche quello che era scartato, si ricordava tutto. Quindi il montaggio era importante per lui.
Everything, the costumes, the music, the construction of the sets, the faces of the actors, it's flawless.
Every scene has a little flourish that you say, I've never seen anything like this before. It's really unique.
I love very much the way he was shooting, and I love very much the way he was using the camera and the cuts and everything. Sergio Leone started a way of making cinema totally different and marvelous.
There is a zoom shot into Charles Bronson's eyes at the moment, the flashback of why he's there on his mission is told. It may be the biggest close-up of an actor's eyes I've ever seen in my life. They've completely filled the screen.
For Sergio Leone, women were very important. And for him, I was very important. Everything was around her, or around Jill.
Perché fra i tanti film che io ho girato, non ho trovato molti registi che amassero gli attori. Il regista vuole essere sempre lui, il despota, il padrone. Quindi l'attore così è uno che si serve di lui, uno che lavora su cose scritte, pensate dal regista. Con Sergio no, Sergio non aveva questo. Sergio era uno che amava lavorare con gli attori. Io ho sempre detto nelle interviste che mi hanno fatto di Sergio che lui lavorava come su una piramide a rovescio, cioè con la punta in basso e la base in alto. Cioè si cominciava con la scena, dopodiché lui diceva levati, e si metteva lui. E lui la ripeteva arricchendola, cioè portando delle cose. Dopodiché toccava all'attore e io mi mettevo lì e la ripetevo con le sue aggiunte. E questo continuava all'infinito finché si raggiungeva una perfezione della scena. Questo era molto bello. Era molto bello, questo denota appunto l'amore che lui avesse e per il cinema e per gli attori.
Right at the very beginning, when they were making Fistful of Dollars in 1964, at one point they wanted to write the music first and cut the movie to the music, as if it was one long rock video. But they couldn't get it together. It happened too quickly. It happened too quickly with the second film. In the third film, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, the final reels, the scene in the cemetery with Eli Wallach running round and round and round, which is very musical, and the scene of the final duel, the music was written in advance. And Leone had it in his mind, but it wasn't recorded and it wasn't played on the set. But Leone knew that he was going to have to cut to this music. But for Once Upon a Time in the West, the entire score was written before they shot a foot of film.
And the first thing he wrote with Morricone was the Jill song. Beautiful. Of course, I remember also Harmonica, Brunson, fantastic.
I think Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone had an incredible partnership in his Westerns, going back to the first. And I think that came to a culmination in Once Upon a Time in the West.
Before, there would be a dozen different themes in For a Few Dollars More, a lot of themes in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. In Once Upon a Time in the West, there's really only about 4 different pieces of music, each one related to a different character.
all these themes, like a Wagnerian opera, were written, one for each character, and then put them together and blend it as the characters develop relationships. All that was written before the movie was shot. And they only played it on the set.
The first thing he was doing, Sergio, was the music. And in fact, during, when we were shooting, first of all, he put the song of Jill, then Chuck, and I was acting. But the music was always there during all the movie.
There's moments in this film where the interplay of music and image is so complete that it's almost uncanny. Towards the end, Henry Fonda rides back to the train to see what's happened on his grey horse, and the horse is trotting in time with Morricone's music. Leone claimed that George Lucas, when he was cutting The Empire Strikes Back, had a copy of the soundtrack of Once Upon a Time in the West in the editing suite because he wanted to capture that interplay of music and image when he was making The Empire Strikes Back. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great story. And certainly it was a breakthrough in sound design. Leone said 40% of a movie is sound. But they had a problem with the opening sequence. And they tried some musical themes, but they didn't seem to work. They spoiled it. And one day, Morricone went to a concert in Florence done by a performance artist. And it was one of these performance artists that was performing in the style of John Cage, the composer, which is that all natural sounds are music if they're played in a concert hall. You know, that it doesn't have to be pianos and musical instruments. You can have ordinary sounds, but if they're in a concert hall, all sound becomes music. And what this fellow performed was a symphony for Metal Ladder, right? So this guy comes onto the stage with a microphone and a metal ladder and does this performance with a metal ladder, entirely making noises of the metal with the microphone. And Morricone went home and phoned Leone and said, why don't we do the entire sequence based on amplified natural sounds? The opening sequence, the water wheel that needs oiling, the fly that keeps buzzing, the telegraph. And then when the train comes, this deafening shriek.
We were writing, it was early 67. It was impossible to be an Italian director and not to be political. I mean, politics was in the air we were breathing, was in the spaghetti we were eating, was in the wine we were drinking. Politics was everywhere.
There is a politics that goes through all of Leone's works, that money is and greed are ultimately the things that are pushing people to do all that they do, you know. So you can say they have a touch of Marxism in them.
When the events of May 1968 happened in Paris, with all the student revolutions and everything, all over the shops were, this year, the style is Sergio Leone. Long coats. And the student population of Paris loved Once Upon a Time in the West. They related to it as a movie about American culture. These were the children of Karl Marx and Coca-Cola, right? A mixture of sort of loving America, but also being left-wing. Those were the students of 68. And Leone was the presiding genius.
Leone really isn't as political a director as some of the other spaghetti Western directors. He's nowhere near as political or as left-wing as Corbucci or as Damiano Damiani, who made The Bullet for the General. Those are much more overtly political films. I think that there is a political element to Once Upon a Time in the West, more so than the previous films, and it has to do with the railroad.
I know people have asked me if I thought Once Upon a Time in the West was political. I don't see it. It looks like a grand, kind of crazy opera, Western opera, in the great Italian tradition of Fellini, who would go off and do these incredible films that I still don't understand, but are beautiful to watch. And I don't see politics in it. I mean, I didn't read it into it. Perhaps you can. I think you could probably read politics into any movie ever made, including Plan 9 from Outer Space. I'm sure there's some in there, too.
After Bertolucci, Argento, and Leone had done their treatment, which was very long, the screenplay was written by Sergio Donati, one of Leone's screenwriters from earlier films, and Leone himself. And Leone wanted to experiment with this rather expansive style of filmmaking. So the script is quite minimal in a way. There isn't much dialogue, but there's a lot of stage directions about the camera moving around and what's going to go on. And clearly, he mispaced himself. Because when he was filming the Sweetwater sequence with the massacre of the family, Leone phoned Donati and said, I'm in trouble. Because if I continue, I've got this rhythm, I've got this pace, this strange pace in the movie. It's like in a Japanese film, that you feel the passing of time in a very slow way, very stylish, very slow, and very self-conscious style of filmmaking, very expansive, like a piece of rhetoric almost. And he said, if I continue like this, the film's going to be 5 hours long. I'm in trouble. What can I do? So Donati came down and joined him in Almeria and sat on the set, and they removed various sequences, some of which had already been shot. There's a sequence where Charles Bronson is beaten up by the sheriff, played by Keenan Wynn, and his men, just after the opening sequence at the station, where, if you notice in the finished film, Bronson suddenly appears with a scar on his cheek, and it's never explained. Well, that's the legacy of that sequence that they immediately cut out. And they also rewrote the script a bit to compress certain bits of it. So, but even so, it was a long movie.
I think that the artistry perhaps has gone over the top and has made the film too long and perhaps too artistic. And that explains perhaps the negative reaction from the studio in the United States and the reason they cut it down so much. They were expecting, a non-stop, wacky, violent entertainment like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And instead they got the longest art Western ever made.
And at preview in America, it was an absolute disaster. I mean, everyone just thought, in fact, the headline in Time magazine was "Tedium in the Tumbleweed." Too slow, too long, just goes on forever. So everyone panicked a bit and recut it.
There's something fun about saying, I just saw a version of Once Upon a Time in the West and there was 3 extra minutes. Or, the version I saw, there was missing the scene where Charles Bronson recovers after he gets shot, And so in that sense as well, there's something quite exciting about it. It's a mysterious film that no one's ever quite seen all of it, And so there's always the hope that next time you see it, you'll see a bit more.
And they took out over 20 minutes of material. And of that 20 minutes, there were 2 big sequences, one in Monument Valley, where they arrive at a wayside inn, and there's harmonica played by Bronson, there's Robards, and there's the bartender played by Lionel Stander, a Hollywood actor who'd been blacklisted, who's on the credits of the film, but wasn't in the movie first time round, because that sequence was cut. That's one long sequence. And crucially, at the very end, the sequence that was cut for release was the death of Cheyenne. That they ride over the hill, and that's the last you see of them. Whereas in the full version, Cheyenne has been shot by Mr. Morton. They ride over the hill. There's a long scene where Harmonica watches Cheyenne die, puts his body over the horse, and rides off into the end of The Romantic Bandit, the end of the West. A really sort of downbeat ending. So those 2 scenes were taken out, and various other bits were pruned to take it down by just over 20 minutes. And it was released in that form. And it wasn't very successful in the States, and it wasn't very successful in England. It was fantastically successful in Paris.
And maybe that's why the film played for those 48 months in one cinema in Paris, because they were kind of proud. This was the only place in the world that you could see Once Upon a Time in the West as Leone intended. I mean, they are a nation, I think, of cineasts.
The first time I saw Once Upon a Time in the West, I don't remember. I do, think that I'd seen it in such a way that I remembered always having seen it. I don't remember the first time I saw it. I think it was in a theater. But I do remember the way I felt at the end of it, that I felt something big had happened. And I had not had that feeling quite the same as that since seeing The Bridge on River Kwai, where you felt at the end of a movie that you'd participated in some grand event. And, of course, I was a big fan of Leone, so at the time, the movie was faulted, and the flaws in it were pointed out and everything. But I knew this movie would last for, forever.
When I saw Once Upon a Time in the West for the first time, I loved it. I remember we saw it at a private projection he had in his house, Sergio. I loved it immediately.
The first time I saw Once Upon a Time in the West, it was at a mega cinema somewhere in Paris, I think a cinema where the film played for 48 months. And I must have seen it there 2 or 3 times. As the print gradually deteriorated and got more and more scratched up, you know, and then the reel changes got more and more funky. But I was lucky in that sense, in that the first time I saw Once Upon a Time in the West, it was a fairly complete version.
I first saw Once Upon a Time in the West on its American release here in the United States. I was a film student. I believe it was 1969, if I'm not mistaken. And it was on a double bill with El Dorado, which is a Howard Hawks Western. I was a big fan of Howard Hawks at the time.
I think he gave back to the proper Western makers. I mean, directors from USA, the confidence that a Western can be a great movie. He gave back something that have gone lost, like we said before, the innocence. He gave back a new identity for the Westerners, something that took off from Monument Valley, went through Almeria in Spain, where Sergio was shooting his movies, and Cinecittà, and goes back to Monument Valley after this kind of little travel to grow up. So back to Monument Valley, the Western was a grown-up.
The amazing thing is that for a film that's almost 3 hours long, there's only 15 pages of dialogue. And in that way, it really does resemble the immortal words of John Ford, which is, a film is a great film when it's long on action and short on dialogue.
It actually incorporates every Western that you've ever seen. It's the great anthology of every moment in the Western, but at the same time, it's its funeral dirge. And now I think it has a real critical and public reputation. You know, in the list of the best films of all time, it comes in the 10 best Westerns and maybe in the top 50 best movies of all time.
Abbiamo perso un regista importante. Io ho amato molto Sergio perché amava noi attori e lavorare con Sergio era bello. Ti sentivi importante, ti sentivi che avevi creato qualche cosa.
They all said to me, why you don't do another one, another Western like this? Because they love it, this kind of cinema. It's a dream, and cinema is a dream.